Hey guys, it's the Metal Blade 5, and welcome to my response to 1 Minute Melee, Season 4. So, to those of you who may be newer to this channel, last year I made a response to 1 Minute Melee covering my personal gripes with the show at the time, and going into somewhat stupid territory near the end, but at the time that video came out, 1 Minute Melee had only recently started Season 3 after leaving Screwattack. Which, funnily enough, my first response actually ended up being uploaded the same day as Asuna vs. Orie. So, the issues that I expressed were only really present in Seasons 1 and 2. However, after I made my first response to the show, and more episodes of Season 3 were uploaded, I really enjoyed them. I found Season 3 to be such a huge improvement over the previous two because all but one of the issues were no longer present. And the one that was still there was in regards to fights in which one character effectively plays the hero while the other plays the villain in that scenario where the hero always wins. But even then, there were only two fights in Season 3 that followed that setup. Hell, I even thought that the finale of Saitama vs. Superman was amazing because it was so fast-paced, ridiculous, and memorable, effectively encompassing the best of Season 3 into one fight. But then Season 4 came around, and I don't mean to sound condescending here, but I felt that this season was a major step back, since I had major gripes with every battle, albeit with differing extents to how much they bothered me. Either due to them having predictable outcomes, being very forgettable, or underrepresenting a character's abilities amongst other things. As such, I wanted to wait until Season 4 finished before making a full response so I could give my thoughts on the season as a whole. So like what I did with my response to DBX, I'll be going through each individual episode of Season 4 and explain my personal gripes with them, in which I will be spoiling the results of most of these fights, so be forewarned. But before I get started, I want to quickly mention that I don't hate 1 Minute Melee, and I don't have anything against the people involved with the show, such as the animators. I mean, the fact that I enjoyed Season 3 should make it clear that I like the show when it's at its best. Also, everything I say about the fights in this video is ultimately just my opinion, with me explaining why I feel that way. I am in no way intending to present my opinion as fact or superior to anyone else's, despite what some assholes say about me with no proof. If you liked Season 4, then that's absolutely fine, and more power to you for finding enjoyment out of something I don't. But now, let's just get to the episodes themselves. So, to start off this season, we have Oni vs. Kenpachi Round 3. To explain the backstory of this fight, the second episode of 1 Minute Melee was Akuma vs. Kenpachi, in which Akuma won. Then for the premiere of Season 2, they had a rematch in which Akuma transformed into Oni and beat Kenpachi again, with the ending showing Kenpachi going off the train to try and defeat Akuma/Oni later on. So this fight is the final round between the two. Alright. Kenpachi has been screwed over too many times. They've had all this build-up to him settling the score, and Bleach fans have really wanted him to win, so it's time he got his revenge! You can't be serious, right? Kenpachi lost. After all that build-up, we ended up with the exact same outcome as the previous two rounds. Then what was the point in doing this? Admittedly, the main reason why I don't like this episode is because Kenpachi lost, just because for this entire arc, they kept showing that Kenpachi wanted to beat Akuma, and after he goes off the train, in which he appears to unlock what I'm assuming is his greatest power, he still loses. It just causes an entire fight and trilogy to end with a really sour taste in my mouth. Granted, I guess you could argue that the build-up would have made Kenpachi winning predictable, but I think having him win would have been better because losing makes all that build-up pointless in the end since it didn't pay off. It honestly gives me flashbacks to Ash vs. Alon, where there was so much hyping up towards the possibility of Ash finally winning in the official league, and then he loses again. And don't get me wrong, I've never seen Bleach, and I know absolutely nothing about the series, so Akuma is actually my preferred character between the two, since I actually know stuff about him. Other than Kenpachi losing, my only issue with this episode is that compared to the previous rounds, I found the fight this time to be more on the slow side. Like, it wasn't super slow or anything, but it did feel less interesting and slightly boring if I'm being honest, which also somewhat contributed towards this episode leaving a sour taste in my mouth. For the next episode, it's Hulk vs. Broly, and my issue with this episode is an issue that I brought up in my response to DBX, being that one character basically acts as a punching bag for most of the fight. In this case, about 95% of the fight is Hulk getting his ass kicked by Broly. Hulk gets very few hits in by comparison. There's even this one part of the fight in which Broly knocks Hulk into an asteroid, in which Hulk attempts to ram said asteroid back into planet Namek in what appears to be built up to some sort of super attack. But then Broly just flies up and knocks Hulk away, so there was a section of this 1 minute long fight in which nobody hit each other and there was no payoff. On top of that, Broly wins, which isn't a surprise at all, seeing as Hulk didn't get to do anything, and Hulk just stands there and takes Broly's planet-destroying energy blast without even trying to stop it. Like with Mewtwo vs. Frieza and Dante vs. Ragnar, in which the loser just stands there and lets themselves get hit by the finishing blow, it makes the ending of the fight very lame in my opinion. Furthermore, I felt that Broly's abilities were severely underrepresented, as for most of this fight, he just uses punches and kicks, with flight thrown in there, and only throws 2 energy blasts. While I'm not a Dragon Ball fan, I'm pretty sure Saiyan characters can do more than just that. And yes, I know 1 Minute Melee doesn't use research, but I don't think you need to use research to have Broly use his other abilities, because it makes the fight less interesting. Honestly, aside from Namek exploding at the end, I found this fight to be very forgettable. And while this video came out after this episode, DBX ended up doing Broly vs. Doomsday, which I thought was much better because I felt that the action was much more epic and memorable, as well as better showcasing each character's abilities. My only other issue is that I found the result of Broly winning to be very predictable, as I've noticed from watching 1 Minute Melee that anime characters very rarely lose. Prior to this episode, the only anime character to lose against a non-anime opponent other than Kenpachi is Asuna, and seeing as how she's a Sword Art Online character, I can understand why! Plus, the last time they used a Dragon Ball character before this was Cell, who lost to Muruem, in which that episode got a lot of hate from Dragon Ball fans. So when I came across this episode, I predicted that Broly was going to win because he's an anime character, and potentially due to not wanting more hate from Dragon Ball fans. Granted, later on in this season, we do see more anime characters lose against non-anime opponents, including a Dragon Ball character in which there isn't a lot of hate, but at the time this episode came out, I found the result to be predictable. So next up we have Rock Lee vs. Sanji. This is actually one of the better episodes in this season for me because the fight was very fast-paced and I found that both characters got around equal time beating each other up, as well as being able to show off their skills. However, for some reason I keep forgetting about this fight when I try to remember all the Season 4 episodes on my own. Although I think that's more to do with me not knowing or hearing much about either character compared to other characters in their respective series, rather than the fight itself. I guess my only gripe with this episode would be that I found the voice acting to be very quiet, along with being drowned out by the background noise.
I am not letting you leave until you tell me what has happened to Sasuke.
I don't know what you're talking about, but if you're after a fight, I'll give you one.
As you wish.
Moving on, we now have Paul vs. Ken, and again, I found this one to be one of the better episodes, and I don't have any noteworthy gripes with this one, aside from an issue which I'll bring up later when it's more prevalent. So as such, I'll just skip to talking about the next episode, which is Joseph Joestar vs. Edward Elric. Similarly to Hulk vs. Broly, my main gripe with this episode is the fact that for the most part, this fight consists of Edward getting beat up by Joseph, in which Joseph gets to show off a lot more of his abilities. And Joseph wins in the end, so it's not like Edward makes an amazing comeback or anything to make it more interesting. Although I will admit that I found the way in which Joseph won to be pretty funny, partially due to the fact that I'm not exactly sure what he did. He plays Jinx with Edward, and then the pendulum explodes? Is that something from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that I'm just unaware of, since my knowledge is very limited, and only to Stardust Crusaders when Joseph's an old man? But outside of that one issue I have with the fight, I still found it to be very enjoyable because it was very fast and memorable. I just wish that Edward got to do more in the fight, because that kind of holds it back for me, as it's an issue that constantly bothers me when present, as it makes it appear very one-sided. And as we get to the next episode, oh boy, this is an interesting matchup.
I'm going to have to discipline you.
Not before you tell me what to say and invoice for damages.
This ought to be a match to remember.
Batman versus Iron Man. Okay, so in this episode, for me at least, we have not one, but both characters feeling underrepresented, as for the majority of this fight, Iron Man just fires frickin' laser beams, while Batman resorts to just using punches and kicks. Outside of that, the only weapons we see either character use is Batman's grappling gun at one point, and only one explosive batarang, whilst Iron Man fires a single rocket at the beginning of the fight, and then only uses the proton cannon at the end. And even then, you could argue that the proton cannon falls under laser beams. I know that since this fight is only going to be a minute long, they can't fit everything they have in there, but for two superheroes who are known to rely on their technology and gadgets to compensate for them not having superpowers, they kind of just stuck to the bare bones of their abilities. Plus, around the last 15 seconds of the fight, it's just Iron Man standing there to charge the proton cannon while Batman throws the explosive batarang and runs towards him. Again, while I know 1 Minute Melee doesn't use research, never in any of the Marvel vs. Capcom games has Iron Man ever had to charge the proton cannon. He just fires it straight away, so I don't see why they decided to change how it works for this fight. As such, I feel that they could have used those remaining seconds to continue more of the one-on-one action and try to fit in more Batman and Iron Man's gadgets to make it more interesting, and then have Iron Man use the proton cannon at the very end. And then this happens.
A little miscalculation on how much power we had, Jarvis?
Well, sorry, old chap.
It's supposed to be a supercomputer, that. How does that even happen?
Sleep tight, Tony.
What?
Batman wins! So, when you pit Batman against an opponent I actually think he could beat, albeit with trouble, he loses, but when he fights someone I know he can't beat, he wins. Just my luck. But in all seriousness, I'm confused as to how Batman won in regards to him being able to avoid the proton cannon. He just runs up to it in a straight line because I guess Batman went to the Prometheus School of Running, and when Iron Man fires it, he just completely disappears, only to be behind him afterwards. And it's not like to show him sliding out of the way, he's just gone in the very next frame. I think what would have been better is when the proton cannon fires, it creates a flash that encompasses the entire screen, so it makes it more unclear if Batman avoided the blast or not. Kind of like in anime fights where two characters create a giant explosion, and then the smoke clears to reveal the last one standing. My only other gripe with this episode, and this is really just a minor nitpick, is that when they do the winning character screen, they refer to Batman as Bruce Wayne. I know they're the same person, shocker, but why not just say Batman? I mean, the episode's titled Batman vs. Iron Man, not Bruce Wayne vs. Iron Man, and when people hear Bruce Wayne, they more so think of Bruce Wayne, as in during the day with the suit. Aside from all of that, the only thing I can think of when it comes to this episode is no! We do not talk about that! Anyway, next is Fei Long versus Liu Kang, and I'm gonna be totally honest here, I found this to be the most forgettable fight of this season. I legitimately can never remember this fight even existing until I scroll through the 1 Minute Melee playlist. I guess it just doesn't have the same level of pizzazz or insanity that a lot of other episodes featuring fighting game characters have, so it just doesn't stick out in my mind. Plus, we have a case of a good guy versus bad guy in this scenario setup, as not only does Liu Kang get far more focus before the fight begins, but they also kind of troll us as Fei Long is actually just Shang Tsung taking the form of him, which I found to be pretty unnecessary. So it makes the fact that Liu Kang wins very predictable for me. But while on the subject of this fight, I guess now is a better time to go over the issue that I hinted at back in Paul vs. Ken, being that in this season, there is an overabundance of Street Fighter characters. I mean, right now, it doesn't seem like much of an issue because this is the third time a Street Fighter character is being used in this season, but there are quite a few more later on. I've got nothing against Street Fighter, and hell, they use a Street Fighter character that I like later on as well. But I think having so many characters from the same series get reused so often across a short number of episodes gets very repetitive. But moving on, we now reach Waddle D versus Goomba. When I saw this fight come up, I was like, oh god, no. Because I thought that it was just going to be a single Waddle Dee versus a single Goomba, and it would have been the lamest thing ever. But I was wrong, as instead it's the entire armies of Waddle Dees and Goombas against each other, including different versions of Goombas from Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story, plus Mario free tanks and airships, with Bandana D, Waddle Doos, even though I thought they were classed as different species, and Kabula on the other side. So, from what I'm guessing is a bit of a joke fight, I didn't think it was that bad considering what they were able to pull off despite how both combatants are complete wimps. Actually, my gripe with this episode isn't to do with the fight itself, but rather the setup to the fight, because I find it needlessly long. The plot is that Bowser decides to go on holiday and leaves Bowser Jr. in charge, whilst the Goombas think that the Waddle Dees are trying to invade Bowser's castle, in which Bowser Jr. orders for a counter-strike. That's the abridged version, but it kind of drags on in the actual video. I think that they should have just opened up with Bowser Jr. immediately in charge, and when the Goombas report on the invasion, they just say, why did this have to happen while Lord Bowser is gone? Or something along those lines, because we see where Bowser is at the end of the fight, so it's not like you needed to show him leaving. Speaking of which...
Smooth as silk. Get ready, Dreamland, cause it's magic time!
They hinted Bowser versus King Dedede happening in the future, in which that will end up being the third time they've used Bowser in 1 Minute Melee, so I'm concerned that Bowser will follow a similar path to all the Street Fighter characters. Anyway, the next episode is Martian Manhunter versus Piccolo. Similarly to Batman vs. Iron Man, in regards to Martian Manhunter, I found that his powers were severely underrepresented in this episode, as during the fight itself, the only power he used was flight, with his actual combat only consisting of punches and kicks. And I find this to be a more major gripe with Martian Manhunter, because he is known for having a shit ton of powers, in which I don't think research would be necessary to know about. Meanwhile, Piccolo got to use a lot more of his abilities, like his key attacks, which made the fight appear to be unbalanced despite the fact that Martian Manhunter wins, in which we finally get a case of a second anime character, outside of Kenpachi, since him losing seems to be a running gag, who loses against a non-anime opponent. Especially with it being a Dragon Ball character losing to a DC character, because hell typically breaks loose when that happens. Aside from that issue, again, similarly to Batman vs. Iron Man, I'm really confused as to how Martian Manhunter won.
Hellzone grenade!
It looked like Piccolo was doing a, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me moment, but somehow only he got affected. Unless they're implying that Martian Manhunter's durability allowed him to tank the attack, it looked like Piccolo was going to win when I first saw this. But then he just ends up unconscious. Plus, I thought that could have been a good opportunity to have Martian Manhunter use another one of his powers, as he has the ability to phase through solid objects, so instead they could have had him phase through Piccolo as he activated the Hellzone grenade so that he would be the only one to get hit by it. Next up, we have Solid Snake versus Chris Redfield, and I have no idea what the connection between these two is. The only thing I can guess is that they both work in the military, but even then they're involved in completely different divisions. Snake specializes in espionage, while Chris works in bioterrorism. But as for the fight itself, I actually found it enjoyable. I'd probably say that this is my favorite episode of Season 3 because it didn't suffer from any of the issues present in the previous ones for me. So as such, I'll just skip to the next episode, which is Ibuki vs. Valentine, where we have another Street Fighter character. So my main gripe with this episode is that it's another case in which one character plays the hero and the other plays the villain. Not just because Valentine is already a villain character in Skullgirls, but also because the plot is that Valentine is trying to kidnap Big Band and Peacock to experiment on them, and Ibuki shows up to stop her. So, of course, Ibuki wins, which I was able to predict because of the scenario. Additionally, I found the way in which Ibuki wins to be pretty anticlimactic. I feel that a final blow in a fight should have more of an oomph than that. At least tap into your inner Michael Bay and throw an explosion in there, or instead have Valentine get sent flying away because in the very next scene she's suddenly slammed up against a wall, which is a very odd transition away from the fight since it doesn't match with how Ibuki beats her. Continuing on, we reach Sasori versus Alice. My thoughts on this fight can be summed up by the following clips. It's very stop-start in my opinion, as there are some brief periods of cool, fast-paced action, but then you have moments such as Alice getting knocked over and wasting time by slowly getting back up on her feet that breaks the flow of the battle for me. This was an issue that I also had with Ibuki versus Valentine, but I find it more prevalent here. If they had cut out moments like Sasori and Alice getting back up, and even Alice just running away for no reason at one point, then I think the fight would have been more entertaining to watch. Granted, I thought some of the action in this episode was good, but interrupting the flow of the battle kinda takes the excitement out of me, since it feels more like I'm watching a turn-based RPG rather than an action-packed versus show. But one prop I will give to this fight is that we finally have a hero versus villain setup in which the villain wins, as Sasori and this other guy, who I don't know the name of since I don't watch Naruto, are trying to kill this one dude, but Alice shows up to stop them, and Sasori wins. I just find it to be a refreshing change of pace, and if they did more villain-winning episodes in the future, then I think it would make future fights with similar scenarios more interesting since they'll be less predictable. Next up, we have Writen versus Jenos, or to be more specific, Writen destroys Jenos, as once again we have a fight in which the loser acts as a punching bag to the winner for the majority of the time. Admittedly, I enjoyed the action in this fight. It was definitely on the epic scale, but Jenos only got a couple of hits in at one point, while every other attack he threw was either dodged or blocked by Writen. Hell, Writen got to do a lot more acrobatic and cool shit, while Jenos was primarily stuck to one general location, trying to blast him until the last 15 seconds, unlike the kind of stuff that I was able to see him doing in his training match against Saitama. And I know that the whole running gag with Jenos in One Punch Man is that he always loses or gets the shaft, but he's still able to do a lot of ridiculous over-the-top levels of fighting, like in the previously mentioned training with Saitama, which I felt wasn't truly tapped into despite him using Incinerate near the end, leading to a fight that felt a bit one-sided to me. But we do also have another instance of an anime character losing to a non-anime opponent, so I guess there's that as well. Anyway, the next episode is Painwheel versus Decapre, and we have another Street Fighter character! On top of another Street Fighter vs. Skullgirls matchup in the same season. But as for the actual fight, my issue is slightly similar to the cases of one character being the punching bag. For most of the fight, I think that both Painwheel and Decapre fight about evenly until after Decapre uses her super move, in which there appears to be a running trend that the first character to use theirs loses, where Painwheel gets super pissed and unleashes a non-stop barrage of attacks. When getting to this part, I was like, I'm pretty sure who's going to win at this point, and yes, Painwheel does win. I think that something like this isn't a problem for shows like Death Battle and DBX where there isn't a time limit, but I find it to be more problematic for 1 Minute Melee just because this occurs at around 20 seconds remaining, so a third of the fight is Decapre getting her ass kicked. If this happened closer to the end of the time limit, then I wouldn't have an issue. And Painwheel is actually my preferred character between the two, because from what I know about Skullgirls, she's the character that I have the most sympathy for, since her backstory is depressing, while the only thing I know about Decapre is that she's one of Cammy's clone sisters. Also, similarly to Ibuki versus Valentine, I found the finishing blow to be anticlimactic. I know this isn't how that move works in Skullgirls, but I think having Painwheel rip Decapre in half would have been a cooler finish, cause that wheel might as well be a giant saw blade. Or at least have Decapre slam into the ground with a large thud as the KO pops up. But moving on, the next episode is M. Bison or Mabison versus God Rugal. So, we have yet another Street Fighter character in this season, and in the very next episode after another Street Fighter character was used. So anyway, I don't have much to say about this fight because I thought it was alright, and I found M. Bison using the Seth doll as a human shield against the Raging Demon to be pretty creative. But like with the previous episode, I found the finishing blow to be anticlimactic.
Meaningless! This place shall become your grave!
Considering how that's M. Bison's super move in Street Fighter 4, I was expecting a much greater impact, like it has there, such as smashing Rugal right into the floor to make a bit of a crater, or at bare minimum to play the KO clip as soon as M. Bison slams Rugal into the floor, rather than slightly afterwards to make it appear more finishing. Also, and this is more of a nitpick, I personally wasn't a big fan of M. Bison's voice in this video.
I have little patience for your lack of detail. Bah! No need for your puny suggestions. Execute this worm.
No offense to the guy that did the voice, but it sounds more like a kid trying to sound like a supervillain to me, rather than M. Bison's stereotypical tough black guy voice in the games. But now we have at last reached the finale of this season. Gon versus Midoriya. So, the structure of this fight is basically the same as the full version of Little Mac vs. Makunouchi Ippo, where it's 3 rounds, each being 1 minute long. But this time they have a much greater emphasis on the plot side of things, in which there was some stuff that I found kind of unnecessary. For instance, there's this one part before the first round where Midoriya is confronted by this creepy clown guy, who I'm guessing is from Hunter x Hunter, who's all like, if you kill Gon, even though there's no proof that you killed people, I'll drown you in your own blood, before All Might steps in and tells him to back off. All this does is that it makes Midoriya lose the first round because Clown Man decided to attach some psychic rope to him to pull him back, in which Gon scares him off after realizing this. So what was the point of that? In round 3 you have Gon win, so it's not like you needed to hold Midoriya back in the first place to have him win. Then there's this whole thing about Gon being scared to lose, otherwise he feels that he'll never be able to show his face again, but this never gets brought up again, and I remember seeing one person in the comments say that's very out of character for him. I'll give them credit for trying to make a plot around this for the finale, but I think it would just be better if they were like, it's a tournament, they fight, the end. As for the fight itself, I didn't think it was bad, aside from this one part in round 1 where Midoriya is just walking to the side for no reason, but each of the individual rounds felt more like they could just be regular episodes of 1 Minute Melee, with each of them being separated by plot. I think it would have been better if they just mashed all 3 rounds together into one fight and didn't have a time limit like what they did with Saitama vs. Superman. Because, while I thought this episode was better than Season 1 and 2's finales, I felt it could have been more epic. Maybe that's just because Saitama vs. Superman set my expectations too high, but that's still how I feel. Then after the credits, they revealed that the premiere of Season 5 is going to be Gohan vs. Superboy. And gee, I wonder how that fight's going to play. What? It's already out? Okay, I didn't expect them to get to Season 5 that soon, so I'll just stop now before I get too carried away. But quickly before I end this off, they also released a bonus episode during the time of Season 4, which I see some people count as part of the season, but even then I do have one major gripe with it, so I'll quickly cover it anyway. Shadow vs. Vegeta. I'll just cut to the chase. I actually really enjoyed the fight, and it's awesome that they got Team 4-star members to voice their respective characters in this. But my gripe with this episode is that rather than it being predictable, we straight up already knew who was going to win. When they did Trunks vs. Silver, Shadow and Vegeta were fighting in the background, and after Trunks defeats Silver, you see Shadow get knocked out by Vegeta. This episode is just showing us how Vegeta and Shadow's fight played out, with it ending in the same scene, so we already knew Vegeta was going to win. You could argue that this episode was more to show their fight going on in the background for those who may have been curious, and I can understand that, but I find that part of the appeal of 1 Minute Melee is that since there's no research, you don't know who's going to win, which makes it more intense. But by knowing that Shadow loses, it takes that away from you. Other than that, and this is a specific personal thing to me rather than an issue, but I'm just tired of Shadow losing in versus shows. I know that Vegeta would easily beat Shadow in a fight, and I know this is contradictory to a point I made in my first response where I complained about time they did death battle matchups where they had the losing character always win. But Shadow is my favorite Sonic character, so I would like to see him win a fight for once. Especially since I think Death Battle screwed him out of a victory against Mewtwo. But that's it for Season 4 of 1 Minute Melee, plus Shadow vs. Vegeta. While there were some parts of the season I enjoyed, I did find it to be a step back in quality compared to Season 3, which I personally found to be such a significant improvement to the show, since it got rid of the majority of my issues with the show at the time. But with Season 4, either a lot of my previous gripes ended up coming back, or in a greater extent, as well as newer personal issues being present with how some of the fights were handled and choreographed. I'm not trying to sound condescending when saying this, but I know 1 Minute Melee can do better, and I hope that they end up improving again with the rest of Season 5, because, kind of like what I said with DBX, I don't want a Versus show to suck, but rather for it to improve and get better over time. Speaking of DBX, I felt that after I made my response to it, that the series started to get a lot better. While the first few episodes after my response contained gripes from me, some of the more recent ones like Broly vs. Doomsday, Aegis vs. Noel, and Cloud vs. Guts were awesome in my opinion. So, while I think that overall 1 Minute Melee is the better show, right now I actually think DBX is better. But of course I only mean this as a form of encouragement to make 1 Minute Melee improve as well. So now that I got my thoughts on Season 4 out of the way, which have been bugging me for so long, I'll see you guys for my next response video. Oh, I've wanted to do this one for so long. He'll never see it coming.